The H represents the places where the horse can move. And the K represents where the king can move. However, when the two are adjacent to each other on separate colors, they can form the rook. Where the rook can move, I've shown with an R. So I'm just going to move the horse ordinarily. That's an ordinary chess move, basic chess move. And in the following turn, the king would be able to move. When the two are together, however, they can be called the rook. And when the rook moves, the king moves on the turn of the horse. And so the rook is a much more effective move than the ordinary pieces moving on their own. It's called the turn of the horse because it's the square before the horse turns. So where the horse would normally go forwards and then turn right or left, it would have to turn off it would be turning off of this square. So it's called the turn of the horse. So when the rook moves, the king is placed on the turn of the horse. Because the mounted unit is always the mounted unit always goes and is placed on the turn of the horse. It's not possible to turn that like that. Only the archer, the champion, and the king can be applied to use the rook with the horse. The other pieces aren't allowed to form the rook. So as an example, the rook can be formed with the bow. That means that the archer and the horse together can make an effective mounted unit. The champion can also form the rook, but only when the champion is adjacent to the king. If the king is not adjacent to the champion, then the rook cannot be formed, and so they have to move independently. If they are adjacent to each other, however, then the queen can move as the rook, or the champion can move as the rook, depending on what you call the unit. Another rule is called captaining. Captaining is when the king uses his movement to move the other units of sword. So where a unit of sword can ordinarily move forwards each turn, the king can also move forwards each turn. The captaining ability is that the king can move with a unit of sword on the same turn. And he does that by shunting the unit forward. This can also be used as an attack move. There's also the ability to move the line. So long as there's a space at the end of the line, the king can move the line. And in that way it prevents gaps from becoming formed. And it makes the king unit a much more powerful piece, because if he needs to he can send an attack order diagonally, or if he's behind a unit, he can create an attack order forwards. And so the centerpiece is much more valuable and has many more commands. Not only does it give the king more units, more abilities to be more effective on the board, it means that the other units of sword are more effective as well, because if a unit charges forwards, then the king can use the attack order to move forwards and then move the line again, and so it creates a much more diverse game. Because if a unit is then, if the enemy unit is there, he can still attack, and it creates more fluidity on the board. You can also use the attack, the captaining ability to create the rook. So that's just a basic order showing how the rook can be formed in 2 moves. The horse has moved forwards. The king has used the captaining ability to charge the unit forwards, because it can charge forwards in the first movement. And he's then formed the rook, meaning that the following turn, when the rook moves forwards, the king has moved as well, because he's moved on the rook. And so there's a lot more fluidity. Another way to form the rook is for the king to use the captaining ability. As long as the king and the horse are connected by adjacent sword, then using the captaining ability, the rook can be formed, meaning that the following turn, the rook can move. The rook can also move as the bow on the first turn, and that gives an advantage for all the people that play chess, because they'll be able to know that the bishop can then change colours by moving on the rook. When the horse moves on the rook and moves over the unit that is mounted, the unit then follows behind instead of being on the turn of the rook, and that's because of the drastic turn angle. So just for another example, if this is to move directly over and to the left, then it moves to the left. Directly over and to the right, then it moves to the right. A really fun opening for the rook is if the rooked bishop moves forwards using the king's captaining ability, because he can order the unit of sword to make its full movement, and then the rooked archer is then placed down, meaning that the following turn the bishop can move, the king can move forwards, and then he's able to move the line of sword, but he's also in the position where he's rooked, and so he can move on the rook the following turn. This adds a whole level of gameplay to chess, and while it might change chess in some circumstances, it's usually for the better, because it gives more fluidity to the pieces of the king and the bow and the horse, and it means that there's much more movements on the board, and it makes it much more fun.